on Online for Authors, I'm chatting with Josh Boldt, author of Moneymaker. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, Terry. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for being here. I love the book. Before we really start diving in, why don't you tell readers what it is they're going to get when they open up the cover?
Sure. So the genre that I like to write in, I like to call it Southern crime. So it's crime fiction set in the South. We've got Southern characters, Southern themes, Southern settings. So all my novels are uniquely Southern. And Moneymaker is actually a follow-up, or maybe we might say a prequel to an earlier novel, which was called Slurry. One of the main characters in Moneymaker, Mack was a small character. He just had a small role in Slurry, but I had several readers who were interested in him and wanted to know more about him, and so did I, for that matter. So he ended up getting his own book, which I didn't foresee coming, as sometimes happens with books, I guess. But anyway, what I did with Mack was I wanted to know what he was like as a younger man. He's, mid to late 40s in Slurry. And I kind of wanted to know how he became what he eventually becomes in Slurry. So we went about 20 years back in time, into the late 90s, which is where this novel is set, Moneymaker. Mack's just gotten out of the Navy, and he has been doing like freelance surveillance work for a couple of different clients around Atlanta. And that's kind of where the story picks up.
Yeah, it does. And it was really cool. I'm curious, why the crime thriller setting? Like what is it about crime thrillers that you say, yeah, now this is the genre I'm going to write in?
You know what? I have no idea why I started writing in that genre. I really don't. I mean, I like one of my favorite authors is Elmore Leonard. I've always really liked him and his style. So, I mean, certainly I've read that particular style. Somebody asked me this once before, and I kind of traced it back to, when I was a kid, I loved the Hardy Boys mysteries.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just a young child, obviously, but I guess that sort of style kind of stuck with me, that like adventure, mystery, thriller. And then of course went on up to read, all the way through. I was like Michael Crichton and John Grisham and those guys.
Absolutely. Right.
So I think I probably could trace, a pattern of my reading habits through. But when I started writing this genre, the first novel I wrote, The False Favorite, I didn't see it coming. It just, all of a sudden I was writing a mystery novel, and sure enough,
there it was.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that you read the Hardy Boys. I read all the Nancy Drew mysteries, and then I started reading the Hardy Boys because I wasn't supposed to. Those were boy books. Those were boy books. And I thought, I'm going to read them. And so I read those too. So I like that you read.
Well done. Breaking convention. I like it.
I started that young. I never liked it when someone told me what to do. And then you brought up that you always have a Southern setting. And I'm curious, why the Southern setting? What said to you, I've got to keep these books in the South?
Yeah, well, I live in Kentucky, Lexington. So certainly the South is my home. But, I think there's, the South is not always depicted in the best light in popular media. And I really like the idea of having Southern characters that are not necessarily the stereotypical characters. Now, that being said, it's sometimes fun to write like the people that I see, in my daily life. And there are certainly those characters in my novels, but I also like to have characters that sort of like buck the tropes, that behave differently than the typical Southern character you see in media. So it was kind of important for me to portray that. But I think more than anything, though, I am a product of the South. It's what I know best, and I listen to the way people talk here, and I try to translate that into my dialogue.
Right. It's interesting. I have written 3 novels, and all 3 of mine have North Carolina in them at some point because I live in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. But I'm not North Carolinian. I grew up in Ohio, and I moved here when I was 15, but I tell everyone, when you choose to live someplace for the next 46 years, you should be allowed to be considered, a Southerner. So I'm not a Southerner by birth, but by choice. And I do like that idea where you kind of give a nod to what feels like your home. So I love that you did that. What was interesting is as I was reading it, I mean, of course, I knew where it was located. I understood where we were, that we were in Atlanta and we were in Savannah, Georgia. And I knew that. But it wasn't until later when I was reading your bio and it said, Southern fiction, that I thought, oh, I mean, it really was Southern fiction, wasn't it? I think that's because I live in the South. And so it just seemed very normal to me that that's where it was set.
Well, I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think to that point, I mean, there are certainly writers whose novels present very Southern. I mean, think like Mark Twain, for example, right, with a lot of dialect. I don't really use a lot of dialect. I try to let the way characters talk indicate that they're Southern characters without like dropping G's and that sort of thing, for example.
Right. I did that in 2 of mine, but in 1 of mine, it's in 1890s and we're in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. And I really needed the characters to drop their G's and say things like "iffin" so that you understood where we were in time. But yeah, right. I agree with you that it was just really good. I enjoyed it. I'm just curious, though, how you came up with an idea for like a surveillance expert and an exotic dancer. Like that's a crazy combination. Like, where did that come from?
Well, okay, so let me set the stage a little bit for those who aren't familiar with the novel. So the story is really told from 3 perspectives. I mean, the primary perspective, I guess, would be Mack Abbott's, but I have 3 different characters who are each telling the story at different points. So the second character you just mentioned, Avery Calloway is her name. She is an exotic dancer, a stripper in Savannah. We get a lot of her perspective. She's mixed up in the smuggling scene down there, which is the group that Mack is surveilling. And that kind of leads us into the third character, which I mean, you might call it the bad guys, although that maybe not necessarily. At least one of them is a sympathetic bad guy. The guy whose perspective we hear from his name is Jerry Mewson.
Yeah.
And we see him, at home with his family. We kind of see a little bit softer side of him, even though he is technically on the wrong side of the law. But let me get back to your question. So, how did I? I don't know. I mean, I used to. Here's something you might not have expected to hear. So I used to write for a newspaper in DC, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I wrote a lot about. We're going to take a real turn here. I wrote a lot about professors, adjunct professors, and the way that at that particular time they weren't being treated particularly well at the universities, weren't being paid very well, and while I was on that beat, I met a woman who had a PhD and worked as an adjunct professor, actually in Georgia. I believe she was in Georgia, who was also a stripper, and that's how she made most of her money. Right. So we went through a series of interviews because I wanted to help tell her story, and obviously it was really interesting too. I mean, it was really cool to hear her perspective on the way she thinks about feminism, for example, as someone who wrote her dissertation, from a feminist lens. So anyway, I don't want to get too off track here, but I did have sort of that perspective after having talked to her for a while, learning about where that comes from. So how did those two connect? Gosh, I don't know. That you just mix it all up in my head and it comes right out, I guess.
That's what I tell people sometimes, because they'll ask those questions and I'll think, I'm not real sure, but all of a sudden the character was there in my head and needed a story and that's what happened. But I did love that. I loved the idea that we've got the Navy guy. He's a little more buttoned up and a little more like what you expect. And then we've got this exotic stripper who's nothing like him. And yet they find a way to connect. And then, like you said, the Jerry, he's a bad guy. And yet I was rooting for him the whole time. I kept thinking, oh, please find a way out of this mess that you're in, because you've got kids at home and a wife that loves you. So you did a really good job with him, because we're not supposed to like the bad guy. And yet I really wanted him to somehow get out of this horrible situation.
Oh, that's so good. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, that's obviously was my goal.
Right.
I like the concept of the anti-hero, you know, like the hero who or the bad guy who has good traits, or the hero who maybe has some bad traits. I mean, I don't necessarily, I like to find that nuance in characters where they're not necessarily all good, all bad kind of thing.
Well, and I think, isn't that the way we want to read a book? I don't normally connect with characters who are all one thing or the other. If they're all bad, how do you, other than knowing they're bad, there's not a lot that you can feel for them. You know, you almost have to have some idea, like, why are they bad?
Right.
What is it that made them that way, so that you can at least have some empathy, at least an understanding of where they're from. And then when it comes to the hero, if they're completely good and all perfect, I don't like them, because I can't relate to them, because I'm not that way.
Agreed.
You know, I try to say I'm a good person, and I am overall, but we can find all kinds of things about me that you could point to and say, well, that's not good. You know, and I want the characters I read in books to resemble that, you know, to have that flavors. So yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it. So you talked about the fact that you kind of came back, you wrote this prequel, you know, to a story that was already out there, that it was not intended. I'm curious then, are you planning to write more? Is Mack someone now that is going to continue on? Are you going to do a third or maybe a fourth with him in there?
I think so. So I've written 3 now, and they all have been, well, published 3, I should say. Yeah. And they've all been, there's been a loose connection. So the private detective in my first 2, there's a lot of overlap there. And then in the second one, there was this small part for Mack, which became a book. Right. I would like to see, I don't want to give too much away here, but I would like to see at some point in the future, like a third part of this Mack Abbott story, where he's like even older than he was in Slurry, and maybe he reconnects with Avery. And they're both in their 50s or something.
They're both in a different place in their life. Right.
Right. And then see how that goes down. You know, I mean, with the way we left the characters in Moneymaker, I think that there's potential that some of that bad blood could rise back up again. And I'd like to see that happen maybe a couple decades into the future when they reconnect.
That would be a cool story. I like that. When you first started your very first book, you wrote it, did you think to yourself, I'm going to continue to do more of a series type book where my characters continue living? Or did you think when you finished that first book that you were done and you were going to move on?
I definitely did not think that. I mean, all of my novels have surprised me. It's like I never quite know what it's going to become when it starts. But no, I never thought that I was going to write a series or characters or stories that were connected. But it's fun to do that, and I think there's some little Easter eggs in there for readers who have read all my books, because they see like, oh, I remember that little character, or that little references. Right. That's right. It's kind of like a world building, I guess.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's interesting because I've been asked about mine, whether or not I will do, a series or a sequel to it or a prequel to it. And I always say, well, I'm not going to say no, but I feel like mine are wrapped up. I think that maybe I have a little bit of ADHD or something. It's like I get done with a character and I'm done. Move on, time for something new. And so I'm always intrigued by people who love their characters and just keep finding that next little nuance with them, because I stand and look at mine and think, well, where would I go with this? I don't even know. I wrapped it up very nicely.
Right. Well, it's funny you say that, because I mean, I've written, I have another one finished since Moneymaker was published, which is in the editing process now. And it's totally there. There are no characters that from previous novels. So I think maybe there was a little bit of that where I was like, okay, I just need to step away and do something a little bit different.
So I'm curious, is the new one, is it in the same genre? Are you still doing the Southern thriller, or is it something else entirely?
This one's different. I mean, it's there's still a crime element, but this is more. I would put this more in like a Southern Gothic category, which is a genre I love. I mean, I'm a big like Flannery O'Connor fan, William Faulkner. These are some writers that I like a lot. And there's definitely Cormac McCarthy, another writer who, at least when he was in his earlier novels, were set in Tennessee. So there's definitely more of the Gothic element in the one that's forthcoming.
Well, wonderful. That sounds interesting. Have you ever considered any other genres? Like, do you have characters running around in your head that are screaming for a different genre?
Yeah. So you're going to get breaking news here.
I love breaking news.
As of about 3 days ago, I started a what hopefully will become a some sort of like a web series or a podcast series that I'm writing with a co-writer of mine. A friend of mine, and we are hoping that it will be sort of like a dystopian sci-fi kind of thing, involving artificial intelligence in the workplace. That's all I want to say at this point.
Yeah, but that sounds great. And so I love that you're willing to like branch out. I think sometimes we get put in a box. My first 3 novels that I wrote all fell into a historical fiction box, although they were very different from one another. And people started referring to me as a historical fiction author. And though I have written historical fiction, I don't feel like I'm a historical fiction author. I feel like I'm a character-driven fiction author, and I go where my characters are. And so if they're in the future, then that's where I'll go. And if they're contemporary, if they're historical, like wherever it is. So I love that you two are willing to like step out of that box a little bit and say, well, this is what's calling to me at the moment. So I love that about that.
Yeah.
You sound, based on some things that you've said, I'm going to say that you are more of a pantser than you are a plotter. Am I correct?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I definitely have. I usually have some sort of a loose outline as far as like what might happen in a novel, but I'm not the kind of person who really plans a lot in advance. I don't really like. I know I have some friends who really deep dive on their characters before they even start writing. They know all about their characters, and I'm more of a person who likes to learn about my characters as they tell me who they are.
Right.
And that sometimes means that I don't necessarily know, what's even going to happen in a given chapter when I start writing. It just sort of comes out and unfolds.
That's the way I write. I'm much more of I've tried the plotting. It doesn't really work for me. My characters get angry and refuse to participate. They look at me like, well, that doesn't sound like anything I would do. And they're just not willing to be part of the whole process. So, but I heard several things that you said where it was like, and it just happened and I didn't expect it. And it's like, yeah, that sounds more like a pantser than a plotter, because plotters tend to know by the time they're writing, they've already done all of the discovery while they're creating their outline. And I just do it the other way. I discover as I'm going along. Right. Have you tried plotting?
Not really. I mean, I would say I can think of one of my 3 novels that was more plotted, where and even that was, I had something like 30 chapters and I had like a sentence for each chapter, and that's about the extent of the plotting that I've done. Yeah.
I've read a lot of books on plotting because I have a lot of friends that plot and enjoy it and feel like it is, the best method for writing. And they tell me you don't have as much editing afterward and all of the other things. So I've read so many books and I get through part of a book on plotting and I'll think, it's not going to work for me. And so then I try something else. And then I think I have finally come to the conclusion that plotting is never going to be how I write.
Sure. I think a part of it for me just comes down to the fact that it's not as fun for me that way.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And if you're going to write a 75,000 word novel, you better be having fun while you're doing it.
You better be enjoying it, because that's a lot of work, right?
Yeah,
and you want to have fun doing that. I absolutely agree. I know you said with the first one, you really didn't expect it to be a thriller. With the others, though, as you began writing, did you know ahead of time that that's where you were headed with Southern thriller? Or I tend to get to the end and say, okay, now what have I written? And then I have to figure out where I'm going to put it so that Amazon knows how to market it. And I tend to just I write, and then it's like, oh, look, it was a historical fiction again.
I mean, yeah, I can look back over the novels and see how I got better as a writer with each of the three. I mean, the first one was more just very linear from the point of view of one character. I mean, it's really fun. I think it's one of my favorite books, and it's my bestseller. The False
That's Slurry, right?
Well, The False Favorite was my first.
The False Favorite. Okay.
It's a Kentucky Derby mystery, which is maybe appropriate for the upcoming month here. But
absolutely.
Anyway, and when I finished that, and I had this mystery on my hands, and I realized, okay, well, I understand this genre. I understand how to tell a story, using the tropes of this style. So when I set out to write the second one, I knew that I was going to write something similar.
Okay.
But that's, in the second one, I started using different perspectives, like a multi-perspective character. And so I could see how my writing developed and, got more complex, but I knew that I was, to your question, I knew I was going in that genre again.
Yeah. Okay. Talk to me a little bit about your writing. Is it a daily thing? Do you have a certain place that you have to write? Tell us, readers love to learn a little bit about the authors that they read. So tell us a little bit about what that process looks like for you.
Sure. So as of right now, I still have a day job. I'm 9 to 5. So I have to figure out when I can write around that. Thankfully, my job is fully remote, and it's my schedule's fairly flexible, so I can carve out a little bit of time here and there as I need to. But I write every day. I usually, let's see here. I can get real granular for you. I have usually right after lunch. I'll make a nice big hot cup of coffee and sit down for somewhere around 60 to 90 minutes is the ideal goal every day.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And I'm assuming you sit at the computer.
I do.
Or are you someone that writes in a notebook?
Nope, laptop.
Yeah, I'm a laptopper too. I can't read my handwriting when I'm done. If I get a thought going and I start writing so fast that I look down and it's just chicken scratch. I don't even know what I've got down there anymore. And big hot cup of coffee. That's something that you enjoy. Is that?
It's my ritual. Yeah, it's not only do I love coffee, but it also puts me in the mindset every day, because I know it's sort of like the trigger. It's like, okay, the coffee, it's time to write, and that helps me with my ritual every day.
I actually spoke with someone not long ago that was talking about these writing rituals and how that's how you get yourself into the writing flow, is if you do the same thing before you write every time, it like switches or flips a switch in your brain and allows your brain to go, oh, we're about to write now. And I thought, oh, that's something, and I don't have that. And so I've been trying to figure out, what do I need to do that will do that for me? And it reminds me of, they talk about good sleep hygiene and how you're supposed to do certain things at night before you go to bed so that you can fall asleep easily. And it's the same thing then with writing. It's we'll call it writing hygiene, where you know what you're going to do before you sit down to write. So I love that. Do you ever write anywhere other than your home? Do you like to go out and do coffee shops or libraries or anything, or do you stick mostly to your office?
I do. I like the coffee shop scene.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, my first one of One of my novels was written almost entirely at a coffee shop.
Yeah.
Now we have, since you mentioned it, we have a local nonprofit here in Lexington, Kentucky, called the Lexington Writers Room, which is a space. It's I guess the easiest way to think about it is sort of like a co-working space where writers can rent a desk, so to speak, where they can come in and write 24/7. They just let themselves in with a key code. It's a very cool place. I mean, not only is it a good place to write, but it's also a good place to collaborate and talk with other authors.
Meet other authors.
Yeah, and just bounce ideas. So, I've been really happy to have found that.
Fantastic. So now you talk about a book that you've got that's in editing. And so you're hoping that comes out when?
Well, I mean, we're getting ready to enter into the pitch process, trying to get it sold. So who knows, really? I mean, it could be a couple of years, but I hope not.
And then you're working on this series podcasty kind of project. And do you have anything else that you're kind of working on at the moment?
Those are the two big ones. I mean, I've definitely got. I'm the kind of person that I always like to be writing something. So really, as soon as I finished the recent draft of my novel, I started this little web series or podcast series and started thinking about what's my next book going to be. So I don't really require a lot of downtime between novels. I mean, I enjoy the writing process. So I'm ready to get rolling again.
I always have ideas and I'll get ideas in the middle of me writing something. And it's like, okay, just be quiet until I finish this one so I can get to that one. I can't, because I can't write more than one at a time. I have some friends that are working on 2 or 3 novels at the same time. And I can be doing writing on one and editing on one and marketing on one, but I can't be writing on more than one because then I feel like it gets all muddled up. So I don't know. How about you? Do you try to write more than one at a time, or do you stick to writing just one?
Oh, I prefer to just focus on one at a time because I'm like you. I mean, I get pretty engrossed in my characters once I get to know them pretty well. Once I'm deep into a novel. And I don't really like trying to think about other, other plots and other characters when I'm engrossed in one. But I mean, I realize sometimes that the reality of the business is you've got multiple, works in progress, but try to limit them if possible.
That's what I try to do. If I don't mind doing some of those final edits and things while I'm writing something else.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't imagine trying to write 2 projects at the same time. My mind would be exploding. Absolutely. So, hey guys, if you want to keep this conversation going, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club on Facebook and look for the post that is about this podcast. And there you'll have a chance to win a digital copy of Moneymaker. So Josh, tell me, if someone wanted to get up with you, talk with you about the books that you've written, about things that you have coming up, how do they reach you?
Oh, I love hearing from people, from readers. I'm on most of the social medias, but probably the best place would just be my website, joshboldt.com, BOLDT, joshboldt.com, and you can find links to all my socials from there. And you can also buy signed copies of all my novels on the website.
Yeah, fantastic. And so I'll have all those in the show notes so that you'll be able to reach out to Josh. And Josh, I want to thank you so much. Enjoyed the book, thoroughly enjoyed reading it and getting to know you better.
Thanks, Terry. Good talking with you.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.